thank you so much, Chris Pupillo, for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Daniel.
You're very welcome. And I hear you have some unique perspectives to add to this conversation on affordable housing. And I just want to hear you out from your perspective. You're from Chicago and you've done things.
I'm from Northwest Indiana.
Okay, but...
So from Northwest Indiana, moved to Valpo 30 years ago now. Spent time in Chicago, worked in Chicago, and have, since I've pulled away from certain issues in Valpo, I've always had friends and maintained relationships in Chicago. So I've done some work in Humboldt Park and the Avondale neighborhood with some groups that advocate for affordable housing, kind of using a model that a man named Tom Tresser, who is like the uber activist of Chicago on TIFs, RDC, Redevelopment Commission, affordable housing and such, and he kind of has a toolkit that a lot of the communities up there use beyond their own, capabilities and experience. And I should say my involvement there is minimal because I don't live there.
Right.
But because I have friends, I occasionally show up to meetings and do some work behind the scenes to help.
Okay. And what have you learned from your work in Chicago on how to combat the unaffordability crisis that you see maybe isn't going on here in Valparaiso? Yeah,
there's a lot there to unpack, and I don't know if we have time for all of it, but I would start with this. Groups there and other groups that I've been part of or follow, there is this understanding that before you can have any meaningful discussion about affordable housing or the lack of it, or they like to talk about housing affordability, because when we say affordable housing, that's often been thought of in big cities as public housing. In small communities like ours, the thought is it's always housing for the poor, and the fact is housing affordability is now moving up the income scale, right? So not just the poor, the working poor and the working class are struggling. And so it's often said that any discussion about affordable housing, and especially affordable housing policy and solutions, has to start with this simple truth that the market has failed us.
Yes.
And if we can't start from there, it will be hard to discuss solutions and policies. And from that, then you can look at both the advocacy side, nonprofits, and those who advocate on behalf of the affordable housing issue, and then the policy side, which is government. So that kind of stands out to me as, can we first agree? And it doesn't mean market wrong, market evil. It just means the market's failed. We could say the same thing about healthcare. The market exists. We're not going to remove it, get rid of it, but...
And who would you say is one that believes that the market has not failed us at this time? Who doesn't acknowledge that?
Oh, I would say most builders publicly. Now, privately, that's a very different conversation. I would say that city government here, John Costas would never stand up and say that. I don't know if any of the city council members would say it. Honestly, I would challenge the nonprofits in Valparaiso who work in the affordable housing sector. I would challenge them to say it. I don't think they would. I think there is a fear to say the market has failed us.
Well, I think that maybe you're right. I'm not sure either, so maybe I shouldn't speak on that. But I did talk to Paul about it. He did talk about how it is unaffordable for a lot of people, and for basically the top quintile of people, it's affordable.
Sure.
To buy a house. But that's not the middle class. Like you said, it's not the middle class or the working poor who were able to afford having a house in 1950s.
Right. Or even 1970. Well, I would say even 1990s, early 2000s, my wife and I bought a home. We have we've always struggled financially. I'm self-employed, and we bought our first and only home, and it was a fixer-upper and then some, and remains as such. It was a struggle, but we were able to do it. But this is 25 years ago. More, actually, 30 years ago, almost 30 years ago. So the change in Valpo that has taken place is both common to what we see throughout the country, but I would argue also somewhat unique in that increase in housing costs has really skyrocketed beyond imagine. I mean, in my little blue-collar, working-class neighborhood over by Ben Franklin, tiny bungalows. Ours was built in 1916. It was one of the first. Lots built in the 20s. We now have tear down, where people are buying a home for a couple $100,000 and tearing it down to put up something that is, certainly selling for $500,000 or more. Coolman Construction and MJF just did that with their recent set of townhomes.
Right.
And there's, I think, a worthy discussion to be had about why and how the city is enabling and encouraging that. But regardless, it's having a real detrimental impact in our neighborhood, which has always been very dynamic and very blue-collar, working class. And when I say that, I mean VU professors, because VU professors are not well compensated. So our neighborhood is filled with VU professors and staff over the 30 years. Oh. And, there's a concern that as those people age, as I age, what's to come?
Right. More houses from the cool coming, perhaps. More teardowns. Even what exists is unaffordable. My son, who's a VU grad, a double major, a master's degree, he couldn't afford to live in Valpo. He looked at a small 1960s era, a single-story ranch that was gutted and upgraded for sure, but small, next to homes that are small and not upgraded, and it sold for well over $400,000. Yeah. Nuts.
So
that's inflated.
Right, but it's what the market will bear.
Yep.
Right? So this is where I say the market is failing us, and I would argue city government certainly is failing us in certain ways. But again, that market exists. We're not going to change the market, but what can we do to mitigate the problems the market creates, to maybe put some downward pressure, or to just carve out spaces so that we have some housing affordability in this community.
So if we do acknowledge that the problem is that the market has failed us, where do we go from there? What policy decisions should we make in order to make affordable housing happen?
I think we have to take a step back before we talk about policy, what particular policies, and acknowledge that we have no policy. The city has economic development policy. They have police and community safety policy. We have a park policy. Robert Cotton, who I consider a good friend, but who I vehemently disagree with on his particular approach to affordable housing. And he was quoted in the newspaper maybe 2 months ago as saying, the city of Valparaiso doesn't build houses. That's true. We don't have a public housing authority. I'll leave that discussion whether we should or not for someone else, but I think that's just a non-starter here. But then he was quoted as saying, and we don't have a housing policy. And he said it in a way as if to say, well, we don't, so we're not going to deal with that. So I would say we need to start with, we don't have a comprehensive housing policy. The city needs to engage in that, and they need to do so with the public and not in these little silos, not behind the scenes, not closed doors, not with consultants. Let's open this up and have a long, ongoing discussion with the community, and let's determine what are the roadblocks or obstacles. Where does the city create roadblock obstacles? And then where might policies flow from there that could help mitigate the affordable housing problem?
So what would you say about the UDO? Is that not a housing policy, or do you say a housing policy is more like guiding principles of like what are Valparaiso's goals for housing?
I think it should start with that.
The goals,
and,
okay.
and be all-encompassing. I think the UDO is a component of it. The problem is, number one, the UDO is being discussed behind closed doors with a consultant. Those who work in this space, my opinion, my experience, they're often bullied, browbeaten, and bought when these discussions happen behind closed doors. So it should be happening in public. One, I believe transparency is the single biggest cure for everything that ails politics on both sides of the aisle. Two, I think city government, civic leaders, our nonprofits, think they have a responsibility to educate the community. Because a lot of people aren't touched by housing inaffordability. And they need to understand what it means, what it looks like, what are the results of unaffordable housing, and what could that mean going forward in the future, and then bring them along for that discussion. Not everyone is going to agree. Mm-hmm. There are going to be some who are going to say, when you talk affordable housing, you mean those people. But that's not the full picture. And so maybe we won't convince them, but I think a lot of folks would like to be brought into the conversation and have a discussion. So let's start with that idea that we need comprehensive policy. Let's set some vision and goals. Let's set metrics, and let's look annually as a city. Once we set goals, once we put in place policies to try and achieve those goals, let's look annually, maybe every 2 years. How are we measuring up? Maybe there should be a city government level person who is in charge of housing, this issue. That was proposed once upon a time by Project Neighbors. That position morphed, and that's a kind word, into the city's neighborhoods. I'm not certain what Maggie Clifton's title is, and I'm not begrudging her what she does in that role, right. But it was supposed to be something very different.
Oh, interesting.
And interestingly, the advocates didn't push back when that was twisted into something else. So maybe we need to look at that again. And again, I think that's part of what might come up if we have this comprehensive approach and this citywide, longer term. And by long term, I mean 6 months. I think we can conduct meetings, we can take input, we can bring in experts, look at possible solutions, and then develop something in, relatively short order.
Okay. So you, to summarize, want to have basically like public meetings where people can come in and discuss what public housing issues there are and talk about the effects of it on those individuals, just so that people can really feel it, not only like have a number, but also feel how that affects their lives and what type of people they are, to maybe break those stigmas of what people think of people who can't afford housing.
Right. And I think you do that. You bring in a facilitator. Once upon a time, Mayor Costas, who I'm frequently critical of, but I'll also be the first to praise him at times. And he put in place this Valpo Next process. He brought in consultants. They were here, I think, the better part of a year. They met with multiple constituencies over the course of many months in many different forms and forums to take feedback, input, and they developed this document, which was essentially a list of priorities. Not from the city government's perspective, from the people's perspective. And by the way, affordable housing appeared multiple times as a key priority. That process was excellent because they really worked to seek out these different constituencies, to meet people where they are, to provide multiple opportunities, and not to have someone talking to them or down to them, but to guide them and to take input. So I think we could do something similar. We would, of course, have to have some expertise. We'd have to have statistics, facts. I would want to hear from builders. What are the obstacles to building affordably in Valparaiso? I know what some of them will say, and so I think the public should hear that, and I think there should be an opportunity to push back or to at least ask if the data supports what their perspective is. And in some cases it will, some cases perhaps not. We want to hear from our affordable housing nonprofits publicly in a way where they truly advocate and where they're not being pitted against one another, which has been an effective game plan of the Costas administration over the years, to pit one nonprofit against another. And I don't want to go into those details here because, but it's all there. It's happened. I mean, I was in the room with some of it when I was a Project Neighbors board member in the past. And I think we probably need a separate grassroots entity so that we give the 2 or 3 affordable housing nonprofits the protection, the space to not have to get up and lead the conversation and fear pushback or blowback, but instead spread that risk and that both that opportunity and the work amongst people in the public who care about this, which We Make Indiana is trying to do. No, they're doing, but in a very, I think, narrow way right now. But that could be a vehicle to help lead this further discussion about comprehensive housing policy, not just affordable. Affordable housing certainly falls within that.
Okay, so We Make Indiana, we could sort of put experts in there and have routine meetings. There's a Portage branch of it, is that right? And we could work with that.
Well, their focus primarily is Valparaiso right now.
Oh, okay.
And they are, and I was part of that on the periphery. I can't make their meetings regularly, but I have been in some of the planning meetings and some of their public meetings. And so they identified affordable housing as a key issue. And they are pushing in Porter County, but initially Valparaiso. And their push is also on the UDO.
Okay.
And so you know, the UDO is an important aspect to look at, but it is not the full solution. The city already grants zoning changes for properties to increase density. The Link is a prime example of that. The Link is anything but affordable. The Link got countless millions in taxpayer subsidies. So to say, let's address the UDO, yes, but if we're just addressing the UDO in closed meetings, in smoke-filled rooms with a consultant, and we're just going to unveil it, and that discussion isn't part of a broader, comprehensive housing policy that recognizes the market failure and the need to build housing at a variety of levels, the UDO will just likely be twisted, perverted by the city and developers to increase density, but still at high cost, and won't serve the people that those like We Make are advocating on behalf of. So We Make very valuable what they're doing, but because it's kind of siloed, if it's not part of a broader discussion, I worry that it won't have the impact that they are really hoping for.
Okay. So they have to outreach more to the community, that it sounds like, and get experts like you were saying. What can maybe we do to get that started, to maybe get those conversations started? And also, maybe is there another structure other than the UDO that should be targeted, should be thought about in order to...
I think there's a lot of policy, very specific policies that we could discuss. And so was it UDO, Unified Development Ordinance, is part of that. And that is, and I'm not an expert at this, but that is basically zoning and all the rules, restrictions that encompass zoning and building. And so smaller lot sizes, right? That can help.
Right.
Fewer parking spaces required. That can help, but that's not going to get us where we want if we just focus on it. So I would love to see a broad coalition of folks come together. Once upon a time, not too many years back, Project Neighbors started that with what they called Housing for All, and it was going to be a grassroots group. We had about 100 people show up to the first meeting, and then it was abandoned. And I'm not going to go there as to why I think it was abandoned. It was. I think because of WeMake, I think there's clearly an appetite. I think the last election, the results proved that. I think WeMake might be the potential broad coalition builder if they want to take that on and expand their role. And I can't speak for them, but they've got some great leadership. They've been turning people out. They're having important conversations. They've identified this one kind of narrow policy, but important. So maybe they could be the one to expand it. But it's got to be the city.
Yeah. It
has to be the mayor and the city council coming together to acknowledge the market has failed us. Paradise Homes ain't going to solve it. Whatever Robert Cotton and the Democrats on city council are calling their narrow solution will not solve it. The nonprofits, who are wonderful, right? They can't solve it alone.
Of course not, right.
Project Neighbors' current project, the largest in their history, 24 units. We lost 240 plus affordable apartment units at Gulfview. If Project Neighbors could build one of their current projects at a rate of one a year, it would take 10 years to catch up. Project Neighbors is not going to be able to build that. So we can't put the burden on our nonprofits alone. We can't rely on the market solely. I think, again, comprehensive policy, acknowledge the problem, set the goals, then create policies within that help us get there, and then monitor, report back, and improve.
What I heard Paul saying is one commission is the RDC, where the Valparaiso government goes and they get very low value property, very cheap property, and they try to basically, at this point, mostly incentivize commercial businesses to build there, and they give them abatements. And Paul's idea is to basically say, why not do that for residential? If you do that for residential, all of a sudden land costs goes down. And then, therefore, there is more of a profit margin where a builder can actually step in and say, okay, this is actually feasible. I can actually make these houses, and I'm contributing to, they can also feel good about it, in other words, because they're just trying to survive too. They're part of this economy, and they're just doing what will actually make or allow their workers to make a decent wage. Because if they do small properties, there's not much that they can get for it.
Well, I don't know that. So that's why this comprehensive policy and looking at the data would be important. I don't know. I don't work in the home building industry. I have a very close family member who does, and based on his knowledge, I suppose I would push back a little on they can't make money. What I think is true is if a builder could build homes at the current rate, the 450 to 750, which is kind of the mid-range for Valpo anymore, and take X profit, or they could build small homes at the same percent of profit, but because the project is smaller, it means less profit. This is where the market and capitalism does its thing. I don't begrudge that builder to say, I'm going to go where I know I can sell them and where I can make more money. That's where the city needs, I think, to step in and identify the problems, the challenges. The RDC, in my opinion, has been the single biggest contributor in a negative perspective, from a negative perspective, to the housing and affordability in Valparaiso. They take property using taxpayer money. They purchase it and they offer incentives to private interest, often politically connected to developers, and they're already building residential. They did it with St. Paul's Square near my house. Now, that was kind of a derelict piece of property, but they came in first. The developer said, I'm not taking any public subsidies. 2 weeks later, it turned around. He was $750,000, and within a year, it went up to $1.5 million. The price was at X. By the time the units were selling, they were selling at X plus 30%. Nothing affordable about it. And that developer, by the way, Bob Kuhlman, has built affordable housing. So we want to hear from Bob. What would it take to get Kuhlman Builders not to abandon the St. Paul Square type projects, but to also re-engage in the affordable housing? And in this case, affordable housing is something above what Project Neighbors or Co-Action, now they're called, might build, right? So, but still affordable. What would it take to re-engage? I want to hear Bob Kuhlman tell me the challenges, both from a market perspective and maybe the city government's role in making it difficult to do that. I think that would be really beneficial. But to do that, again, this has to be in public. This has to be transparent. We all need to be educated and hear these multiple perspectives. And the way it takes place in Valpo, everything's done behind closed doors, and it's all buttoned up neatly and then presented to the public with the appearance that we'll take input, but they don't.
So, well, I don't know. Where do we go from there?
Well, that's a challenge, because I don't know that anyone in government is listening. Certainly, the Costas administration is not. They will try to tell you that with their Paradise Homes, they're tackling this. Not only is that a tiny percentage of building, but those affordable homes become market rate homes in a matter of years. I've tried to get the answer to this. No one will respond, but if you're lucky enough to qualify and purchase a Paradise Homes home, you're getting basically a government subsidy to purchase it at below market rate. And should you sell that house within a period of years, and I've been told 5 years, but I can't confirm that, you don't get, as the homeowner, you don't get to keep all the profit. So you can't buy a house at, let's say, 20% discount, turn around and sell it in a month or a year or 3 years and take that profit. But that scale fades quickly. There's a better way. And if we had had this comprehensive housing policy in place, if we would have had public discussions, we might have been able to convince the mayor and Bill Oding. I mean, this is a city-run nonprofit, Paradise Homes. We might have been able to get them to see the light that there's a better way. Community land trusts, where a nonprofit owns the land. They are essentially leasing the land to the homeowner. The idea is that you have two components in the cost of buying a home. The home, the building of it, the construction, everything that goes into it, permits, and then the land. Well, if that nonprofit owns the land and the homeowner owns the house, then that nonprofit can hold the land at, whatever base rate they determine. So land in Valparaiso is skyrocketing because we're an in-demand community. Imagine if Paradise Homes or another entity were holding that land value at essentially zero. And when the homeowner sells, they're not taking any gain from the land because they don't own it.
Right.
This is a proven strategy that's worked throughout the country. I believe Carmen Vincent, the new director of Project Neighbors, I believe I have this right. She was just mentioning that she thinks this is something that's taking place in Michigan City. I know someone in Oregon who's worked with a group that has done this. So is that the end-all, be-all solution? No. Would it work here? I think so, but I don't know. But if we don't have the discussion, we can't vet these policy. That's just one. And because we don't have this comprehensive approach, we might have a little effort here, a little effort there, but at the end of the day, it's not going to amount to anything consequential because it's not coordinated, and we're not able to measure it, because there's nothing worse, in my view, in government And I'm an advocate for government, by the way. I'm not an advocate for big government. I'm not an advocate for small government. I'm an advocate for effective and efficient government. So let's measure both the success of the government, but also the market in Valparaiso once we have this policy, this comprehensive policy and plan and these initiatives, and let's see what works. And let's double down when it works. And if it's not, let's adjust, let's adapt, or let's cast it aside.
What measurements do we want to get? We want to get what has been done in other places and how effective it has been? Or what type of metrics do you think that people should be measuring in order to evaluate what we should do, right?
Yeah, I'm not smart enough to know that in its entirety. I'm a big believer in seeking out best practices, and best practices does not mean a consultant, because anytime a government, regardless of who's in charge, which party is hired, they are hired to help bring about a rubber stamp of what the preference already is of that government. So let's look to nonprofits. Let's look to experts elsewhere. Let's see what worked. Measurements, I would want to see things like year over year increases in housing costs. I'd want to know the true measure of our housing stock. There was a survey that John Costas, a study, conducted maybe 10 years ago. It was part of his Altogether Valpo Commission something. And they brought in a company. They did a study about the housing. And when they released it, Bill Loading redacted the conclusion because the conclusion was damning. We had to fight to get that made public. The city then, with some of the people on the commission, found ways to undercut the methodology, of which the leading expert on kind of data collection and studies in this community weighed in and said, yeah, there were some minor flaws, but it doesn't change the outcome. I would go back to that. I would look at the ALICE report, and I don't remember what that acronym stands for, but it looks at it statewide and I believe county, and it's a measure of kind of poverty and people who are struggling, but that does a disservice to the depth at which they report.
But if we were to type it in right now to the internet, we'd say Alice Report Valparaiso, and then maybe it would be public information?
I don't know that, and I think it's Porter County and maybe a subset. Dr. Larry Boss, former, Larry.
I know Larry.
Larry knows this stuff inside and out. He would be able to answer. I don't want to mislead people into how readily available, but we know, because we've seen these reports and studies in the past, we know that there's data there. But that really just tells us the problem or where we're at. I would want to look at what kind of measurements do we take, what kind of goals do we want to set, and how do we measure that success. So if we magically had a city-initiated process that looked to develop a comprehensive housing policy, and that policy developed that overall policy, and there were goals and then individual policies within that help meet those goals, I would hope that there would be an opportunity to measure the success of those goals. Have we increased housing starts at this end and at this end? Have we successfully addressed the need to provide more affordable housing for people retiring? Not everyone can afford to live in a $500,000 townhouse or condo. I certainly can't. So as people age out, where might they go? We have young people who cannot afford to live here. The RDC and the mayor have, in the opinion of most folks, done a magnificent job transforming our downtown into a kind of a food and hospitality mecca. Regardless of your opinion on that, those are all people who are, certainly if not part of the working poor, the working class. And I know many of them, and they can't afford to live here or they struggle. So here's a good example, I think, of why this policy is important. The city council, now dominated by Democrats, so I can't pick on the Republicans, which is normally my tendency. They approved a taxpayer handout subsidy for the Urschel Gardner Hotel being built. Yeah. Now, if we'd have had this policy in place, that decision to approve that taxpayer handout would have been measured, at least in part, by how many jobs are we creating, how many of those jobs are full-time, and what are they paying? The agreement between Urschel Development, the Gardner Hotel, and the city states, if I remember, 24 full-time equivalent jobs. Well, you don't have to be in the know to understand that that means a couple of full-time jobs that probably pay well and a whole lot of part-time jobs that don't. So we're creating a business. We're subsidizing a business, and a great plan, great project, by the way, but we're using taxpayer money to subsidize it to create jobs for people who can't afford to live here. So if we measure these RDC handouts of taxpayer money against not just the impact to the developer and the people who can afford to eat out 3 times a week, but what about the people living there? Are we bringing in more and more workers who just can't afford to be here, or the people who already live here? That's part of a comprehensive approach. At least you can have that conversation as a city government before making those decisions instead of, and I'm making a rubber stamp motion right now.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a really big problem. I doubt that the people working downtown, the servers, the bartenders, etc., can afford to live here on their own, and it's just not enough. We may have nice restaurants and all these nice services, but yeah, it's carving out a lot of jobs for people who have to migrate here, right? Essentially. It's not exactly like Chicago. I shouldn't go into that, but it's like, yeah, it would be nice if the people who worked here could be a part of the community too.
Absolutely. And that doesn't mean living in the lap of luxury. It just means being able to afford to live here. And as insurance costs go up, automobile costs go up, groceries and consumer goods with inflation, there's this federal model or number that says you shouldn't spend more than, I think it's 30% of your income on housing.
Right.
Well, I think that model's probably outdated because we've now seen costs other than housing really skyrocket, which means people, especially at the bottom end, and again, I don't mean just poor. I mean working poor, working class folks, single moms, retirees who don't have a solid retirement savings, they're being pinched on both ends. Housing costs are going up, their income's not, and the other costs are going up, so that 30%, is probably more like 20, 25%. So let's look at that, and then let's make these decisions as a community. What types of businesses are we bringing in, and who do we subsidize? We subsidize with taxpayer money the wealthy, the well-off, and the politically connected private interest with no proof that it benefits the city's bottom line, because that RDC captures all that money back in a TIF, right, for 20 years. So it doesn't go back to our schools. It doesn't go to our streets, our parks, our police. It doesn't contribute to lowering our tax rate. The mayor likes to always focus on, we've been lowering our tax rate steadily. Well, the reason we're doing that is because housing values are going up. That's the only reason. No one has seen their tax bill lowered or even static in the near 30 years I've been here. So that's I would say that's not a misnomer. I would say it's intentionally misleading. So what is the impact of what the RDC does? We've got a great example of this coming up. Property east of town, east of 49, that was purchased using the ARPA funds, which was supposed to go for the betterment of the community, health and other things. And the city bought it through the RDC, and they said we were going to build a sports complex. Now, I wasn't a fan of that, but people weighed in, so be it. Then that was canceled. Then it was going to be a data center, and we had to rise up and say, Well, now the city's made plans. They've hired a consultant who's going to unveil those plans next Wednesday at City Hall. And it's going to be TIFed, which means the RDC is going to have, it's a money pot for the RDC, because that means any increased assessed value and the taxes that flow from it don't go to the city. They go to the Redevelopment Commission, who then hands it out to more private interest and politically connected developers. So here's an opportunity for the public to weigh in and say, here's what we want. I'm told it will be mixed use. We'll learn that Wednesday. Let's make certain that some of that mixed use property goes to housing affordability at a variety of levels. How great if Project Neighbors were gifted by the RDC a small portion of that land to plan to build something in 2 or 3 years, and maybe Housing Opportunities Now co-action. How wonderful if Habitat for Humanity, which I think is defunct in Valpo. I know they couldn't afford it a few years ago. They might be doing a project. Wouldn't it be great if a couple houses or a couple lots were gifted to them to build? Wouldn't it be great to bring Flaherty and Collins, who the RDC previously fawned over, bring them in and say, hey, we want you to develop some affordable housing for the elderly.
Yeah.
And then build houses at market rate of various sizes and costs. And presumably there will be some retail and maybe some other commercial and maybe even light industrial. I don't know. But here's a chance for the Redevelopment Commission to actually do some good in solving this problem, and not in a tiny token way of occasionally giving one, little crumb to whomever, whatever nonprofit.
It's a huge plot of land, so there's a lot of potential.
Yep.
So if people do go to it, yeah, you're definitely right. It's a huge opportunity for change, to have people's voices be heard. Hopefully this comes out before that meeting, so that people can have the opportunity to know that they should go to this meeting. But if not, let's post about it online tonight.
Right, and I think people will be in the coming days. I am told that they're not going to take questions or comments at this meeting, but they'll allow you to write them down on a note card. Haven't been able to confirm that. There's some conflicting information coming out within what they call the stakeholders group. But I'm also told there will be maybe a portal or an email opportunity after the meeting for those who can't attend, because the meeting is kind of inconvenient, which RDC meetings always are, 4:30.
Oh.
If you kind of work for a living like a regular job, you can't go. So I'm told there will be opportunity to chime in. So yeah, this is our opportunity as a community to start to weigh in about some of the things we want included, given whatever this consultant / architect is going to present as, I suspect, a framework, not an absolute plan, but to say housing. And I don't know that. We just don't know, because they're being very opaque about it up front.
Which it's never really translucent with the RDC, is it?
No.
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 Well, what else is there to cover?
Well, I kind of touched on my belief that we need advocacy. And I have been critical of some of the nonprofits and people that I, at least at one point, was friendly with for not advocating. Mm-hmm. And so I come back to the need that maybe that advocacy now needs to come from the people, which is hard to organize. And I hope that we can expand, because they are doing that work. I absolutely praise them for that. So I'm hoping that they might, for instance, take the lead in turning out people to the RDC meeting and expanding this conversation.
They should.
From a policy perspective. So I had a conversation with another Democratic city council member who I consider a friend, and I've expressed frustration with the secrecy in which the Democrats are crafting their very narrowly focused plan, and also that that's process related. We always blow the process in Valpo. It's always opaque. But policy-wise, the response was, well, affordable housing is hard and we're part-time and blah, blah, blah. And I said, I agree. But you were elected to do hard things. This is, I think, the most important thing in many ways in the city, the most important issue. And I would argue it's not that hard. Many years back, when I was still a board member on Project Neighbors, when the thought of Democrats even gaining a seat was just a glimmer in our eye, we produced a document and for a number of years a website called ABC, Agenda for a Better Community. The housing portion of that, which was led by Paul Schreiner and Larry Boss with input from others on the board, was kind of the cornerstone of that. Again, I'm kind of surprised that that's been abandoned. That, in my view at least, should be the organizing principle by which anyone who, a nonprofit, anyone who cares to advocate for affordable housing should look to that document, because it had, I've got a copy here on my phone. I'm just going to kind of briefly read through.
Yeah.
I guess I didn't number it, but there's probably 12 to 15 very specific items. And I'm going to read through a few. Hiring an individual at the city whose job includes researching and advocating for and representing the need for quality housing for all. Mm-hmm. Establish a quality housing for all advisory committee. Create a quality housing for all fund from filing fees, increased user fees for high-end housing, and through RDC funding. Let's see. Create a city land bank. I talked a bit about that, right?
Yeah.
Let's create a city land bank. Require developments of high-end housing to set aside a percentage of lots for housing for people at a lower economic level, or pay into that housing for all fund. This is very common in big cities. You don't want to meet the housing guidelines set up by the city that says a certain percentage has to be affordable, fine, then you pay a fee. So instead of us always paying developers a subsidy, when St. Paul's Square was built, when the Link was built, set aside 10% of those units at a greatly reduced rate. Oh, you don't want to? You're going to pay into this fund instead of the taxpayers paying them to do this. Let's see. Use tax abatements to help lower income persons own their own home and encourage development at all income levels. Zoning variances, so that's UDO. That was a part of it. Incentivize building smaller units. So there already exists a framework put together by the leading experts in affordable housing, Project Neighbors, and two of its somewhat original founders and certainly leaders throughout the years. Right. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, but let's not do that in the back room with John Costas, Bill Oding, the Democrats and Republicans on city councils. Let's have that discussion and put these up for debate and discussion and the merits of them, and then welcome other ideas from builders, from developers, from other advocates and nonprofits, from the community, and let's source those best practices, because this problem is being solved, not entirely, but people are chipping away, groups are chipping away around the country. In Valparaiso, this is a categorical truth. In the 20 years this issue has mattered to me and I've engaged at one level or another, the problem has only gotten worse. Project Neighbors and Coaction cannot build themselves out of our problem. They are just falling more and more behind despite their Herculean and heroic efforts. So it's going to take something different, and it's going to take a more thoughtful and comprehensive approach. And we can't wait. We can't wait. We need to start this now. Wouldn't it be great if this East Side RDC TIF project, unfortunately, it'd be cart before the horse. We can't put in place that comprehensive policy, but from that, we can push for things that maybe could help contribute to that comprehensive policy and improvements over the years.
Right. I think that's a great idea. Use that as a framework for whatever we propose at this meeting where we can't really give that much input. But thank you so much for sharing your perspective on this, Chris Pupillo.
Thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure.
And I look forward to watching this, not so much to hear myself, because I always hate that, but I know you've got some really dedicated, thoughtful people, some who have contributed the better part of their lives to this issue. And so I look forward to hearing from them and watching and listening in the very near future. Thank you, Daniel. And you're doing an excellent job with this show. I just have to say that as someone who kind of works in this space somewhat from a professional perspective, the shows are always thoughtful and well put together, and your guests I'm intimidated being here because I've listened to your other guests. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.